Okay, so we started last week with Christians in politics, and before we get into that, just a reminder, shameless plug, trip to Turkey to study the early church in Asia Minor, Clash of Kingdoms, which has a lot to do with what we're talking about in this class. It is May 19th through 30th, and I'll put up something at the end. You can either go to my website, Stepping into the Jordan. There's a little place called Study Trips you can click on, or you can just use that QR code on your phone, and I'll put this up at the end after we finish. So as we look at Christians and politics, I want to remind you of the ground rules of what we're trying to do. First of all, this is not a class about policies, although we may talk about some policies. This is not a class that's designed to support a particular party platform over another. This is not a class that is going to be talking about why Republicans are going to hell or why Democrats are going to hell. This is a class about how Christians engage in politics, regardless of where you happen to find yourself on the spectrum of whatever the issues might be. And I can guarantee you that within this room we have people on all sides of no matter what issue it is that comes up in our current culture. And today we're going to be looking at what I call who's in and who's out. Or maybe us versus them might be another way to think about that. And I want to start off by looking at a word that gets used fairly often. And that word is ideology. What is ideology? Someone uses that word, what do you think of? The way someone thinks, okay. Okay. Anybody else?
Study of ideas.
Say again.
Study of ideas.
The study of ideas, okay. Yeah, study of ideas. Okay. What else?
What they believe about certain things.
What you believe about certain things. Okay. What else? Perspective. Okay. Anybody else?
I would probably just combine what's already been said. It's the perspective that one has that shapes how you view things.
Okay. So there's what's the word I'm looking for? There's an impact to these things that you believe in, how they shape, how you believe things ought to be, how they ought to work. Okay.
Major influence in your life?
Say that again.
It becomes a major influence.
A major influence in your life. That is very, very, very true. We're going to talk about that as we go through. Really, what ideology comes down to is it's the values, it's the beliefs, it is the philosophies, it is the social structures, it is the political systems, and it is the economic systems that as a culture we share. Okay? Or I should say that the dominant or the majority of the people share. And so what happens is ideology defines or describes, I debate how to decide it, I think it defines the culture in which we live. And it is so ingrained in us that we can't escape it. But it does change and shift. And when it changes and shifts, the reactions that people have to those changes and shifts can be extreme. And I think in our climate today, we see people saying things and making claims that reflect that what's happening at a lower level, at a base level, is changes in ideology, or shifts in ideology, or battles over ideology. Things like, they are threatening our way of life. You've seen that claim made in a political ad. I don't care which side it is, but you hear that. Another one that I've seen one side make more than the other. We are not going back. Okay? There's an idea in there that our ideology is here, and they're trying to make us go back to an ideology over here that we don't want to go back to. Okay? They want to destroy our values. Again, ideology. And since I gave one on one side, I'll give one on the other. Make America Great Again is an ideological statement. It's an ideological statement that we were like this before, we're not like that now, and we got to go back to be like that. Okay? And it's based on a view of the dominant ideology. Okay? And I'll say, for example, if you are a black person, going back to the America of the 1950s is not really good news for you. If you're a white male in America, about my age, going back to the 50s sounds like really good news. Okay? But that doesn't mean it's good news for everybody. And so all of these are struggles that happen when our ideology begins to shift. And it shifts all the time. So here's the question. What is the dominant ideology in the United States today? Again, to sum it up in a few very simple words, what would it be?
Gimme, 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 gimme.
Okay. There's an aspect to it. That's very true. Okay, anybody else?
Freedom.
It's my right.
It's my right. I heard something over here.
Freedom.
Freedom.
Individualism.
Individualism.
Live your own truth.
Live your own truth. Okay. Here's how scholars define it. White, patriarchal capitalism. That's the dominant ideology in the USA. White, patriarchal capitalism with Protestant Christian overtones. Now, that means you may not like it, but I think when you begin to look around, you begin to see that that is what dominates our culture. I'll give you some examples. Has anyone in this room had to take off for work for a day of vacation because of a religious holiday? Nope. One of my professors, who's on my dissertation committee, is Jewish. And in his syllabus for his courses in the spring, actually in the fall too, but especially in the fall, particular day off for Yom Kippur. Okay. Our culture is set up. We get Christmas off. We get Good Friday off a lot of times. You know, we get Easter's on a Sunday, so we really don't have to take off for that. But our culture is wrapped around Christian sort of ideals. The battles that women have had to go through to get, equal pay in the workplace, to get maternity leave, all point towards a patriarchal system where the man is the one that goes out and works. It's funny, it's little things, you'll see it on TV, there's just very small things that show up. Look at, I always love doing this. It struck me when we were in Austin at Westover, we had a guest song leader come in. I can't remember his name. He used to be with Acapella. Black guy.
Rodney something.
Yes, yes. And so they asked him, they said, hey, would you like one of the little mics? You know, like Wade uses. And he's like, no. He says, I don't use those. They don't match my skin tone. And sure enough, have you ever noticed you can't see Wade's mic? Why? Because it's the color of his skin. But if you're African American and you put on that little mic, okay, as convenient as it might be, it shows out like a big old white line down your face. Okay? It's a subtle thing, but it's how ideology slowly influences and infiltrates every single thing that we do. And in our culture, it's white patriarchal capitalism. Now, how do we make decisions? And especially political decisions around political issues. And I got this from the book we're using, which is the book that shows up on the first screen, The After Party, by Russell. What's Russell's? Russell Moore, Curtis Chang, and David French. And this is an image that they have in their book that I mostly agree with. I don't 100% agree with it, but it's this idea of how we think we make decisions. Not how we actually make decisions, but how we think we make them around political issues. And that is that as Christians, we think that we are taking the scriptures and we are taking Jesus, and that we are using them to decide what is the right way to think about policies, okay, and which party we belong to, which then leads us to a justification of the what. And the what in this case is, what do I think about this issue? What do I think about abortion? What do I think about gun rights? What do I think about how government should work? Whether it be capitalism or whether it should be big government or small government, okay? We start with how we view Jesus, and that leads us to pick the party that we think most aligns with our beliefs based on what we think of Jesus, which leads us to the what. Okay? I'm not going to go into what's wrong with it, other than that's just not how we make decisions. But it's how we think we make decisions. Okay? And so the challenge of that is that we believe, we tell ourselves that all of our policy stances are rooted in Scripture. And if our policy stances are rooted in Scripture, they must be authoritative. And they're not really open to change or discussion. And that anyone who holds an opposing view is against God. I'll tell you a quick story. I was last year on this trip to Turkey. It was a joint trip between me and another church here in Frisco. And it is a pretty conservative church. And I was sitting at lunch with a couple of guys from that church, and one of them happened to say, he said, it really irritates me when I hear people say that the Bible supports social justice and communism. That's just not true. And I said, it can equally support that as much as it can support that capitalism is God ordained. And the guy sitting across the table from me looks at me like I had just said there was no Santa Claus to the tree. It's like, what do you mean capitalism isn't God ordained? And I was like, goodness gracious, why do you think it is? I mean, it's like, well, first of all, the Roman Empire wasn't capitalist. Israel wasn't a capitalist empire. Christianity works in any social system, any economic system. Christianity is thriving in China right now. Okay, under communist rule. So it is not that capitalism is the God-ordained system under which economies work. That's not how it is. But in his mind, through this sort of thought process, he had come to the conclusion that, well, capitalism is the only God-ordained way to run a nation. It's not. It's not. So, ideological battles aren't new. And let's look at some examples from the Bible. The Israelites returned from exile in Babylon. Okay? And one of the big issues they face, if you'll remember, is when the Babylonians carried people off into exile, they took all the rich people. They took all the people with power and influence and took them to Babylon. They left all the poor people there in the land. They didn't have any interest in taking them away. And so, 70-something years later, Cyrus, king of Persia, tells all the exiles in his empire, y'all can go home. And as long as you pay taxes and as long as you be good, build your temples, worship your deities, do whatever you want. And so the Israelites, and in 3 or 4 different movements, moved back. And when they move back, they find a local population that really, quite frankly, is like, we kind of got along okay without y'all. And now you want to come back and take over again? So it created a lot of friction. And one of the questions you go, well, who is a real Jew? And you see in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you see things like a real Jew is someone that went into exile and came back. And oh, by the way, if you stayed here and you happen to marry a foreigner, you got to divorce them. No intermarriage. And they cite Deuteronomy. Right? No intermarriage. Well, then you got the book of Ruth that says, well, hold on a minute. Here's this Moabite woman who comes to Israel and lives and is the great-grandmother of David. Is she a real Jew? Deuteronomy says that David can't enter the temple if you look at how close he is to being a Moabite, nor could Solomon. Who's a real Jew? Or what about Esther? Here's this woman who becomes the queen of our oppressor. And she saves her people. Is she a real Jew? So you get this debate in Scripture as to who's a real Jew. And then under Greek rule, after Alexander the Great comes in and defeats the Persians and takes over this area and his successors, the question becomes, to what degree can a Jew adopt Greek culture and still be a Jew? Because Greek culture influenced everything. And they kind of come down to 3 things. It's circumcision, eating kosher, and observing the Sabbath. Those are the non-negotiables. Everything else, there's flexibility on. And then under Roman rule, how should Jews respond to their Roman rulers, i.e. oppressors? And I want to look at that a little more closely and note that God's people held wildly different views on all of these issues, and they based their decisions on Scripture. So, should you cooperate with the Romans or should you oppose them? And we see that there are different groups of people in the time of the New Testament, in the Second Temple, that say we should cooperate with the Romans. The Sadducees, for example, the Herodians, and the tax collectors. Okay? These are people that saw having a good relationship with Rome was going to be advantageous for them. Get along with the people in control and everything's going to go well for us. The tax collectors, you could argue, took it to a different level. For them, they realized this is an opportunity for us to make some money. Because Rome would sell the franchises for collecting taxes. And so they would sell it to the highest bidder. And the tax collectors were free to charge the local people whatever they wanted, so long as they gave back to Rome what Rome expected. Okay? So here you have a group of people that are taking advantage of, and you could even argue cheating, the local population to enrich themselves in cooperation with Rome. Well, on the other side, of the opposed to the Romans, you have the Pharisees. Okay? You have a group called the Zealots. And you have another group called the Sicarii, which are kind of like zealots on steroids, that are looking to politically assassinate collaborators with Rome. And then you have this big group of people that are just called the people of the land. And that's the everyday person who just wants to go about their daily life and doesn't want to get involved in this, that is just trying to survive, regardless of the situation. That doesn't have time to deal with all this stuff. And all of these people justify their positions based on the Bible. For example, the Zealots or the Sicarii would say, if I'm ordering the laws in terms of importance, for them, outside of the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, they would say, thou shalt have no other gods before me, supersedes thou shalt not kill. And therefore, if someone is collaborating with Rome, supporting someone who claims to be a deity, to be the Son of God, then I can kill them because they are idolatrous. Their interpretation of Scripture. Sadducees don't believe in anything beyond the Torah as being authoritative, the first 5 books. The Pharisees believe that it's not only the Torah, but their oral traditions plus the prophets, the rest of the books. So they all view these things differently to come to different conclusions. So, the question is, where does Jesus land in this big mix?
We need a Venn diagram.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe it needs to be a Venn diagram. Where in the world is Jesus in this mix? And here's what's kind of fascinating. We're going to look at a couple aspects. Let's look at Jesus' social life for a minute. Okay? They make a statement in this book that I found hilarious. But Jesus attended lots of parties. I don't know if you ever noticed that. He attends so many parties that at one point his detractors accuse him of being a glutton and a drunkard. Okay? Think about that for a minute. You know, how many stories do we have about Jesus going to somebody's house for dinner? I'm kind of an introvert. That's just sounds awful to me, right? You know, to go to all these parties. But let's look at who he parties with. Luke 7. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to eat with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. Okay? Luke 14. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat at a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. Okay? Here we get, on the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the wedding. And we all know what happens there. Okay? We don't know which group this is. You could argue it's the people of the land. Just the everyday folk. Then we have, from another passage in Luke, he entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, he has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Pharisees, people of the land, tax collector. Mark tells us, and he sat at dinner in Levi's house. many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the scribes and the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Why does he eat with the collaborators with Rome? And then the larger passage from Matthew 11 says, "For John came neither eating and drinking," and they said, "He has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking," and they say, "Look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds." Jesus socializes with people on every side of the political divide in his time. Both sides. Now, where does he get his disciples? Where does he get the 12 that he's going to be charged with spreading the kingdom after he's gone? During those days, he went to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. And when the day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, and James, and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So, I want to pull out 3 of these in particular. Matthew was what? This passage doesn't tell us, but we know from other passages. Matthew's a tax collector. Okay? A tax collector, meaning he's of a family that is largely perceived as cheating the population by collaborating with Rome. Simon is what? Zealot. And Judas Iscariot. This one's a little hidden. The thought being, Iscariot, it probably isn't a last name. The thought is that in Hebrew, what that word is Ish Kariot. Ish means man. Kariot is a place. So a man of Kariot. Kariot was a known zealot stronghold in the Second Temple period. So Judas is also likely of the strong opposition to Rome, a zealot. Some claim he's a Sicarii. I don't buy that. But I think he's definitely on that side of the political spectrum. And so when we lay these out on this map that we had earlier, you've got Matthew on one side, you've got Simon and Judas on the other, and then what do we know about Peter, James, and John? They're fishermen. They're part of the people of the land, who probably don't have a real good opinion of either side. They're probably getting cheated by the tax collectors. Taxes on the poor can be anywhere from 40 to 60% of their income. Huge tax burden on the people of the land. And yet they also can see the zealots causing trouble for the people in the land because of the activities that they take, especially in the Galilee, which is where the zealots were pretty strong. Questions, comments? Jesus pulls the 12 from all sides of the political divide.
That was because he was apolitical.
He was apolitical. That's an interesting observation. So I'm going to argue that how Jesus does this is that Jesus rarely engages in the what of politics. But what he does engage in is the how. Okay? We don't see anything necessarily in the Gospels that says he brings Matthew and Simon and Judas together for a come to Jesus meeting, right? To kind of sort out their differences. We don't see anything like that. But what do we see Jesus do? We see him teach, love your enemies. We see him teach, turn the other cheek. We see him teach, if forced to go 1 mile, go 2. Now, that's a political statement. Because in the Roman Empire, a Roman soldier could force an average person to carry their backpack for 1 mile, but no more. 1 mile was the limit. So by exposing and saying, no, I'm going to take it another mile, you really cause an issue. Because now this person is like, hold on a minute. No, you're getting me in trouble by carrying it further, right? It becomes a political statement. But it still is a political statement that says, I'm going to call attention to the plight of the people by going the extra mile. The same with turning the other cheek. If you backhand a slave, you're hitting them on, which I can't, don't want to demonstrate, right? So if you backhand them, you're hitting them on their right side, which is allowed. But to turn around and slap the other direction is not. Okay? So, if you slap them this way, and they turn and expose the other cheek to you, what are they doing? It's somewhat of an act of defiance, and it's saying, do it on the other side. It's a resistance statement. Okay? But it's not turn around and slap them back. Do you see the difference? He says, give to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God's what is God's. Yes, sir?
Caesar didn't own anything, he took it.
Say that again?
Caesar didn't own anything, he took it.
Okay. So the question is, does he mean by give to Caesar what is Caesar, God's what is God's? Does anything belong to Caesar? But he's still, possession is 9/10 of the law, right? So there's that. Let you who is without sin cast the first stone. Jesus is more concerned with the how than he is with the what. So what does that mean? And what Moore and Chang and French come up with in their book is they flip the diagram around. And they say, rather than focus so much on the what, perhaps what we need to do is take the ideas of the what's, the how do we feel about this issue or that issue, and run it through the lens of Jesus' how. And the focus then becomes spiritual values, relationships, and practices. And what they claim is that those spiritual values are love, mercy, justice, truth, hope, and humility. So, the spiritual values supersede the what of party politics and policy. And they are not suggesting that you give up your position on a particular issue, but that you look at it through the lens of Jesus. And so, for example, in the case of opposing Rome or cooperating with Rome, regardless of your position, whether you think we should cooperate with Rome or that we should oppose Rome, the issue of love your neighbor takes precedence. So how do I oppose Rome and still love my neighbor? How do I cooperate with Rome and still love my neighbor? Let's take a more modern issue. You can be pro-life and say, how do I act with mercy and humility and justice towards a woman who finds herself in a situation where she doesn't know what she's supposed to do? And by the same token, you could be did I say pro-choice? Or say pro-life? Yeah. You can be pro-choice and say, yes, I support this woman who is in a situation that she doesn't know what to do. She doesn't know how she's going to survive with this child or with another child. And also say, how do I become more proactive about advocating for the unborn? How do I love my neighbor either way? How do I act with humility towards the situation that each of these individuals might find themselves in, regardless of the position I take? It's often said that, that people who are pro-life care about the child before it's born and care nothing about it after it's born, and those that are pro-choice care nothing about the child before it's born, but only care about the child after it's born. Why do those have to be two separate issues? The how of Jesus says the what has to be influenced through spiritual values, spiritual relationships, and practice. Questions, comments, thoughts?
I have a question about
Yes, sir.
ideology shift. So you said it shifts and changes often. The three key white patriarchal and capitalism
Yes.
in our lifetimes, all of us, it hasn't really shifted outside of the African American bringing up, this is now white, but the whole societal change hasn't shifted. And so I'm curious, how does it shift often?
Sure. How does it shift?
Is there enough
Sure.
people that get behind the momentum of the shift?
Yeah.
Or church then follows it?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So how does ideology shift? So I think if you look at, I think it's generational. Okay? I don't believe the same things my parents believed or believe. My kids don't believe the same things I believe. Okay? They have a different perspective on these various issues. Okay? As an example, because I do think it changes within, I think we see shifts within our lifetime. So for example, it's probably easier to go jump a generation. So my grandfather, okay, he had expectations about who was to cook dinner and when dinner was to be on the table when he got home, and who, he had very specific views of the role of a woman in the household versus the role of a man. Okay? My dad held many of those same views, probably less strongly than his father did. In my household, my wife hates to cook. I actually like to cook. Okay? So I do most of the cooking. My wife's parents live with us. My father-in-law can cook eggs and hot dogs and TV dinners. Okay? And probably popcorn, and that's about it. Okay? And he hates it. So when they moved in with us, it was like, all right, cook meals every night. You know what I mean? So there's shift in roles. Who is it okay to do what? Women in the workplace. Big shifts. Women having the right to vote is less than 100 years old in this country. Women having the right to seek divorce is, 60 years old? Women being able to hold their credit card in their own name without their husband's signature is 50 years old? Okay? So there are shifts that happen in ideology and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, that are that happen gradually. The battles are always going on. The 1960s was a huge battle over race. 150 years ago, the Bible's being used to justify slavery. So it shifts all the time. It shifts all the time. And these battles we see and the words we use to describe it, I think you can go back generation after generation and see the same sort of words being used over and over again.
But you also see a lot of that change in the church and how we how things. I know.
Yes.
At my age, I remember I grew up in the church, as we call it.
Yep.
And things have changed dramatically in most churches. We still have some that are holding on to the old views,
Yep.
that very patriarchal views. But most churches, as we viewed this morning on the Lord's Supper,
Yep.
was, I thought, wonderful.
Yes.
But I'm sure there were some people out there squirming too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so I just think that we have to realize why the changes are there.
Yeah.
Whether
And-
they are for the better or for the worse.
And-
And that's all subject to our upbringing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say this, there's also a difference, if you look at the black church, for example, okay? The black church tends to be much more theologically conservative than white churches. But they are much more progressive on certain social issues than the white churches because of the lived reality of the people under the influence of the dominant ideology. Yeah. We're going to talk a lot more about this. We're going to look some more at it next week. I want us to just say that shifts in ideology create visceral reactions, and we see it happening all the time. What happens is, when we focus on the what of politics, we create binaries, us versus them. But that what Jesus encourages people on all the sides of an issue of his day. He invites them to the table. He makes them his disciples. He engages with them. And then he picks his disciples from all parts of the political divide. And he shifts from the what to the how. And we as Christians, as we engage in politics, need to think more about the how than the what. And when we engage with people that may think oppositely to what we do on a particular what, it's better for us to engage in a how discussion with them to see what sorts of positions and understanding we can accommodate. So, next week, we're going to look more at how we engage the how. We're going to look at hope and humility. We're going to look at some passages in Luke. So Luke 9, Luke 10, and a passage in Mark. So thank you all very much. We're going to play with the configuration of this room a little bit and see how we can make it so we get a lot of discussion and make it more engaging. So thank you all very much for the comments, participation. See you all next week.